In the late 17th century, the town of Dundee stood tightly gathered along the north bank of the River Tay. From a distance, it might have seemed peaceful. Smoke rising gently from chimneys, fishing boats resting in the harbour, church towers marking the skyline. But towns in this period did not live gently. They lived closely. The streets were narrow and uneven, paved with stone slick from rain and refuse. Timbered houses leaned inward over the closes as though sharing secrets, their upper floors almost touching across the gap. Windows were small, light was precious, privacy rarer still. Dundee was a borough of trade. Cloth, grain, salt, skins. Merchants moved goods along the Tay, and money moved through careful hands. But beneath commerce lay something far stronger than profit. The kirk governed daily life with a firmness that few dared question. Attendance was expected, conduct observed, behaviour noted. Sermons were not brief reflections, they were warnings. The devil, the ministers insisted, was not distant. He was active, present, and persistent. Every illness, every crop failure, every sudden death demanded meeting. And when meeting could not be found in weather or chance, it was found in people. It is difficult now to imagine the atmosphere of 17th century Scotland without understanding the depth of religious intensity that defined it. This was a society that believed utterly in spiritual warfare. Heaven and hell were not abstractions. They were destinations as real as Dundee's harbour. And Satan was not metaphorical. He was an adversary who sought agents, witches. In this environment, suspicion required very little encouragement. A neighbour who argued, a healer whose remedies worked too well, or failed at the wrong moment. All could draw attention. And once attention hardened into accusation, it rarely softened again. Among the residents of Dundee was Grissel Jaffray. She did not hold public office. She did not command wealth. She did not possess influence. She lived modestly, quietly, on the margins of security. Like many women of her time, Grissel understood herbs, poultices, and remedies passed from one generation to the next. Knowledge learned not from books, but from memory. In any other century, this would have been called medicine. In this one, it walked a thin line, because knowledge that existed outside church authority was dangerous, and knowledge possessed by a woman, doubly so. Dundee was not unique in its fear. Across Scotland, witch hunts had already swept through towns and villages in waves. Entire communities had been drawn into cycles of accusation and confession. Scotland's witch hunts were among the most intense in Europe. Proportionally, more people were executed here than in many larger nations. The reasons were complex. Climate instability brought failed harvests and famine. Disease moved without explanation. Infant mortality remained heartbreakingly common. When suffering has no visible cause, societies look inward and then begin to search for blame. The structure of accusation was deceptively simple. A neighbour claims harm. A minister listens. Officials gather testimony. Soon, a narrative forms. The accused is rarely allowed to dismantle it, because by the time formal charges are raised, the town has already decided. Fear spreads quickly in confined places. A look becomes a whisper becomes certainty, and certainty, once achieved, does not retreat easily. Grissel lived in such a town where every door was visible, where behaviour was weighed, where difference stood out. We do not have records describing her voice, or her laughter, or her manner of walking. The official documents that survive record only accusation, trial, and sentence. They do not describe the person, but memory does, because long after the records cooled and the trials ended, Dundee remembered her, not as a witch, as a woman. And that distinction is where her story truly begins. Before she was accused, before her name was written into legal record, before fire claimed her body, Grissel Jaffray was simply a woman living in Dundee. It is important to begin there, not at the trial, but in the quiet, ordinary days that came before. Because witch hunts did not begin with spectacle. They began with familiarity. Grissel likely lived in a modest dwelling, stone walls, timber beams darkened by smoke, a hearth that was both warmth and necessity, windows small enough to conserve heat, floors uneven, light precious. Daily life was repetitive and physical. Water carried, wood gathered, food prepared from what little could be afforded or grown. The rhythm of the seasons mattered more than the turning of a clock. Women like Grissel lived close to one another, separated by thin walls and thinner patience, in narrow closes where conversations travelled easily and disputes travelled faster. Reputation mattered, and within those small spaces, reputation mattered more than wealth. Grissel was known for something that made her useful. She understood remedies, herbs gathered from hedgerows, roots dried carefully, leaves steeped into bitter infusions, poultices pressed gently against fevered skin. This knowledge was not unusual. Across Scotland, women carried practical understanding of illness. They learned from mothers and neighbours, observing which plants soothed pain and which ones harmed. But knowledge becomes dangerous when it begins to appear mysterious. If a remedy worked, gratitude followed. If it failed, or if illness worsened, suspicion crept in, and suspicion was easier to hold than uncertainty. A child sickens unexpectedly. A cow stops giving milk. A man develops a fever and does not recover. 17th-century Scotland did not yet understand bacteria, infection, or contagion. What it understood was morality. If something went wrong, and if no sin could be identified, someone must have caused it. The idea of maleficium, harmful magic, was not abstract. It was accepted as a practical explanation for misfortune. Grissel's remedies placed her close to moments of crisis. She would have been called upon when illness was already present, when fear was already high. She would have stood beside beds where mothers wept quietly and fathers tried not to show panic. If the patient improved, she was helpful. If the patient died, she was remembered. This is how the ground shifts beneath a woman's feet without her noticing. The late 17th century was not kind to the vulnerable. Scotland had endured decades of upheaval, religious reformations, political instability, crop failures, plague outbreaks. Communities were strained thin. Trust was fragile. And in fragile communities, difference stands out sharply. Grissel may have been widowed. She may have lived without strong male protection. She may have spoken firmly when challenged. None of these were crimes, but they were risk factors. In societies governed by strict religious oversight, independence was often read as defiance. A woman who did not conform entirely to expectation could easily be recast as suspect. The Kirk watched behaviour closely. Church elders monitored attendance and moral conduct. Records were kept of quarrels, absences, and disputes. A woman who missed sermons might be noted. A woman who argued might be remembered. And a woman who carried knowledge outside scripture might be questioned. It did not require malice to begin the process, only discomfort. Imagine a neighbour who once felt slighted, a mother whose child did not survive, farmer whose livestock weakened, all searching for a reason. The accusation rarely began as a dramatic declaration. It began as a statement of doubt. She was there when the fever worsened. She muttered something under her breath. She looks at people strangely. These small fragments gather weight over time, and once spoken aloud to the wrong ears, or the right ears depending on perspective. They became testimony. In Dundee, ministers preached of the devil's subtlety. They warned congregations that Satan worked quietly, disguising himself through those who seemed ordinary. The witch was not expected to appear monstrous. She was expected to appear familiar. Grissel would not have recognised the moment when suspicion solidified. There is no record of her reacting publicly to rumour, no surviving words of protest. But history tells us that by 1669, the murmurs had grown loud enough to reach official ears. Once authorities became involved, the tone changed. Accusation moved from gossip to inquiry, inquiry to arrest, arrest to imprisonment. From that point onward, the path was difficult to leave. Witchcraft trials in Scotland followed a pattern. The accused were isolated, questioned repeatedly, pressed to confess. Confession was not optional in practice. It was expected. The system did not exist to determine innocence. It existed to confirm guilt. And the most devastating truth of all is this: most of those accused were ordinary, like Grissel, not powerful, not secretive, not dangerous, only vulnerable. A woman who knew herbs, a woman who lived without strong protection, a woman whose knowledge strayed beyond approved boundaries. In a different time, she might have been thanked. In this one, she was watched. And in towns where watching becomes habitual, someone eventually decides to act. The day of her arrest would not have felt dramatic. No thunder, no spectacle, just a knock, just a summons, just the quiet understanding that the town had shifted and that she stood alone against it. To understand what happened to Grissel Jaffray, we must widen the lens. Our story does not begin with her. It begins with a country. 17th century Scotland was not a stable land. It was not a place of quiet certainty. It was a nation shaped by religious upheaval, political anxiety, economic strain, and environmental hardship. Fear did not appear suddenly. It accumulated. Across Europe, the 16th and 17th centuries were marked by what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures fell. Harvests failed more frequently. Winters lingered longer than expected. Storms battered crops at the worst possible times. In agricultural communities, this was not inconvenience, it was survival. A failed harvest meant hunger. Hunger meant weakness. Weakness meant disease. When illness followed famine, communities searched desperately for explanation. And explanation was not found in weather patterns or climate cycles. It was found in moral frameworks. God was sovereign. God was just. Therefore, suffering must have a cause. If crops failed, perhaps faith had faltered. If plague spread, perhaps sin had taken root. If misfortune struck repeatedly, perhaps evil walked among them. The devil, according to Protestant theology of the time, was active and organised. He sought out the weak. He entered into pacts. He worked through individuals to disrupt godly order. The witch was not simply a practitioner of magic. She was an agent of Satan. Scotland, following the Reformation, developed one of the most rigid Protestant systems in Europe. The Kirk, the national church, held enormous authority. Ministers were not merely spiritual leaders. They were moral regulators. They monitored behaviour, enforced discipline, and reported deviation. The system created a culture of observation. Communities were encouraged to watch one another, to report suspicious behaviour, to guard not only their own souls, but those of their neighbours. Suspicion became a civic duty. Between the late 16th and early 18th centuries, thousands of people were accused of witchcraft in Scotland. A significant proportion were executed. Proportionally, Scotland's rate of execution far exceeded many larger European countries. This was not random hysteria. It was structured belief. Local courts were empowered to investigate witchcraft. Special commissions were issued. Legal mechanisms existed specifically to extract confession and validate accusation. The accused were often subjected to interrogation practices designed to produce admission. Sleep deprivation was common. The body and mind, deprived of rest, begin to fracture. And when fracture occurs, confession follows. It is easy to ask why people confessed to impossible things. To flying through the air, to attending secret gatherings, to speaking with the devil. But confession was often the only way to end suffering. In a society that already believed in witchcraft, confession did not create guilt. It confirmed it. One of the most significant forces behind Scotland's witch hunts was the belief that the nation itself was under threat, that God's favour depended on rooting out corruption. The witch was not seen as an isolated criminal, but as part of a network, a conspiracy. This paranoia intensified during times of political instability, and 17th century Scotland was rarely free of it. Civil wars, religious disputes, tensions between Crown and Parliament. In such climates, control becomes precious. accusing witches provided a visible demonstration of moral vigilance. It reassured communities that leaders were acting, that evil was being confronted, that suffering had explanation, and crucially, that it was not random, because randomness is terrifying. Blame is easier. Most accused witches were women, older women, widows, healers, those living on society's edge. Why? Because power structures in a patriarchal society rooted in religious obedience, independence could be reinterpreted as defiance. And defiance, in spiritual terms, resembled rebellion. The witch hunts were not purely religious phenomena. They were mechanisms of control disguised as moral necessity. And they worked because communities believed they were necessary. When a town like Dundee experienced illness, crop failure, or unexplained death, it did not require officials to impose fear from above. Fear already lived there. All that was needed was a name. Once a name entered the narrative, the structure took over. Grissel Jaffray's life intersected with the structure at the worst possible time. By 1669, Scotland had already endured multiple waves of witch hunting. The cultural script was well established. Ministers knew what signs to look for. Courts knew how to proceed. Communities knew how to testify. And once the machinery began turning, it did not slow for doubt. Grissel's accusation did not emerge in isolation. It emerged from a system refined by decades of precedent. A system that believed deeply in its own righteousness. A system that interpreted tragedy through theology. A system that had convinced itself that fire was purification. In this climate, innocence offered little protection. Because the question was not, did she do this? The question was, could she? And once possibility was accepted, certainty followed swiftly. Grissel was not targeted because she was uniquely dangerous. She was targeted because the country had learned how to hunt, and because Dundee, like many towns, had learned how to believe. After the Reformation, Scotland did not simply shift religious identity. It reorganised power. The Protestant Kirk became more than a spiritual institution. It became a moral surveillance system woven into everyday life. Ministers and elders were tasked with overseeing conduct, recording disputes, and reporting deviations. They watched, and what they watched for was not merely crime, but corruption. Witchcraft in this context was not viewed as superstition. It was treason against God. And when religious belief intertwines with national identity, spiritual disobedience becomes political threat. One of the most influential figures in shaping Scotland's witch hunting climate was James VI of Scotland. Before becoming James I of England, he ruled Scotland in a period of deep instability. He was young, often vulnerable to political manoeuvring, and acutely aware of threats, real or imagined, against his authority. In 1590, James became personally convinced that witches had attempted to kill him by conjuring storms at sea during his voyage home with his bride, Anne of Denmark. The North Berwick witch trials followed. Confessions were extracted, executions carried out. And James, fascinated and alarmed, wrote a book on witchcraft titled Demonology. In it, he affirmed the reality of witchcraft. He described it as organised, deliberate, and conspiratorial. This was not a fringe belief. It was royal endorsement. When a king legitimizes fear, that fear gains structure. Under Scottish law, witchcraft was a capital crime. Local authorities could petition for commissions to investigate. Special courts were established. Interrogations sanctioned. The machinery was official. Witch trials were not chaotic mobs acting independently. They were sanctioned processes, often documented with chilling bureaucratic calm. When an accusation was raised in Dundee, it did not remain local gossip. It entered a legal pathway. Ministers gathered testimony. Witnesses described alleged harms. Officials documented behaviour that appeared suspicious or deviant. The accused might be searched for a witch's mark, an insensitive patch of skin believed to be a physical sign of a pact with the devil. This was not about gathering evidence in the modern sense. It was about confirming narrative. And narrative had already been shaped by theology. Because the Kirk taught that witches met secretly, that they conspired in numbers, that they threatened the spiritual health of the nation. To uncover one witch was to potentially expose many. Thus, interrogation often pressed for names. Confession was rarely isolated. It expanded outward. This expansion created cycles of accusation. Fear multiplied itself. Politically, witch hunts served another function. They reinforced obedience. Communities learned quickly that deviation, even minor, carried risk. That authority must not be challenged. That conformity ensured safety. Women were particularly vulnerable in this system. Their legal standing was limited. Their testimony weighed differently. Their independence often interpreted as disorder. This circular logic was devastatingly effective. In towns like Dundee, officials were not necessarily cruel individuals. They were convinced that they were protecting their community, convinced they were defending the divine order, convinced that fire was purification rather than destruction. The witch hunts were not sustained by sadism alone. They were sustained by belief reinforced by power. Few dared question proceedings openly. Better to agree. Better to testify. Better to confirm what everyone already feared. When Grissel Jaffray stood in front of the court, the question was not simply, could Grissel have caused harm? It was whether the community could afford to leave the question unanswered. In times of uncertainty, leaving a question unresolved feels dangerous. Better to close it decisively, even if that closure demands fire. When Grissel Jaffray was formally accused in 1669, the machinery we have already described did not roar to life. It moved quietly, deliberately, almost calmly. That is what makes it unsettling. Grissel would have been summoned, questioned, perhaps confined. The records that survive from Scottish witch trials are often procedural rather than emotional. They list charges, they summarise testimony, they document confessions. They do not capture the human experience of standing alone in a chamber where every eye assumes guilt. The accusations against her followed familiar patterns. She was said to have used harmful magic, to have caused illness, to have interfered with the health of others through unnatural means. These claims rarely required physical evidence. Witness testimony, especially from neighbours, carried weight. If someone claimed harm after a quarrel, it could be interpreted as witchcraft. If livestock died after disagreement, suspicion sharpened. In communities already primed to believe, coincidence became proof. Grissel was likely questioned repeatedly. Interrogation during this period was not the measured exchange modern audiences might imagine. It was persistent, repetitive, designed to exhaust. Sleep deprivation was a common tactic in Scottish witch trials. The accused could be kept awake for extended periods, watched constantly, denied the rest required for mental clarity. Under such strain, the mind begins to blur. And when clarity blurs, certainty weakens. Confession was central. Courts preferred it. Theological doctrine supported it. But confession did not always emerge willingly. Some accused denied persistently. Others resisted until their bodies or minds could no longer sustain resistance. We do not know every word spoken by Grissel Jaffray in that room. We do know that by the end of proceedings she was condemned. The courtroom itself would not have resembled the grand halls of later centuries. It would have been modest: timber beams, stone walls, officials seated at a table with parchment and quill, clergy present, observers perhaps permitted, the air thick with candle smoke, Grissel standing alone. It is worth pausing here to consider the psychological weight of such a moment. To stand before neighbours, people whose faces were once familiar, and hear them describe you as an agent of harm. To watch as private suspicion transforms into public condemnation. To understand slowly that the narrative has solidified beyond your control. The charges were likely read aloud, formal language with legal phrasing, but beneath the structure lay something deeply human. Fear. Fear that illness would return if she was spared. Fear that God's favour depended on visible action. Fear that failing to punish would invite further suffering. The trial would not have lasted long by modern standards. Witch trials were rarely prolonged affairs. Once accusation hardened into formal proceeding, outcome moved quickly. Grissel was found guilty. The sentence was death by burning. In Scotland, those convicted of witchcraft were often strangled before being burned. A grim concession meant to shorten suffering, but this detail varied, and records are not always clear. What is clear is that execution was public. It was not hidden. Execution sites were chosen for visibility. Crowds gathered. Officials presided. Fire, in this context, symbolised purification. Grissel would have been taken from confinement to the place prepared for her death, bound, surrounded by people who had once lived beside her. There is no record of her final words, no preserved speech, only the certainty that she died because her community believed it necessary, and afterward, silence. The official record would have closed the matter. Case concluded. Justice delivered. But silence in documents does not equal silence in memory. History rarely preserves the voices of those it condemns. The flames would have risen steadily. Smoke carried upward into the air above Dundee's rooftops, and in that moment, a life ended. Not quietly, not naturally, but deliberately. Those who watched could not unsee what they had witnessed. Children present would remember. Neighbours would carry unease. Even those convinced of her guilt would feel the finality of flame. The machinery had functioned as designed. A name had been offered, a threat identified, a punishment delivered. But the deeper question, whether fear had been cured, remained unanswered. Afterward, there would have been no extended ceremony. Ashes scattered, officials satisfied, the case closed, the town dispersing, markets reopened, doors shut, but fire leaves residue, not only on stone, but in memory. Public executions create shared experience. They bind communities together in action, but they also bind them in the aftermath. In the days that followed, Dundee did not transform dramatically. No riots, no sudden reckoning. Yet subtle changes occur when a community has crossed a moral boundary. Some would have felt relief, the threat removed. Others would have felt unease, an unspoken discomfort difficult to name. Because while fear can justify action in the moment, it does not always serve the conscience afterwards. Witch hunts did not end immediately in Scotland in 1669, but their intensity was already beginning to wane. Scepticism, though faint, was emerging in some quarters. Legal standards were slowly tightening. It would take decades more for formal prosecutions to cease. But by the early 18th century, the fire had largely burned itself out. Scotland began to change. Enlightenment ideas crept in. Scientific understanding expanded. The rigid certainty of earlier decades softened slowly. Yet no official apology came. No formal reversal. Those executed for witchcraft were not rehabilitated in their lifetimes. Their names lingered quietly in parish records. And in Dundee, Grissel Jaffray did not entirely vanish. Because while official history closed her case, communal memory did not. The house, Dundee's ancient burial ground, remained at the heart of the town. Stone markers weathered, names faded. Grissel did not lie there. Witches were often denied proper burial within consecrated ground. Why did Grissel endure in memory when so many other accused women faded from collective consciousness? Part of the answer may lie in proximity. Her execution took place in the heart of Dundee. Her life was woven into its fabric. The witnesses were not distant villagers, but neighbours. When the Enlightenment began to soften Scotland's intellectual climate in the 18th century, doubt entered spaces where certainty once ruled. People began quietly reassessing the past, looking back at witch trials with discomfort rather than pride. And in that reassessment, figures like Grissel transformed from criminal to casualty, from witch to woman. The Grey Lady's continued presence, whether literal or symbolic, serves as reminder that justice once failed, that fear once overpowered reason, that faith, when fused with power, can burn the innocent. Towns do not apologise easily. They modernise, they rebuild, they rename streets. But they rarely pause and say, "We were wrong." For many years after the death of Grissel Jaffray, Dundee did what most communities do after difficult events. It continued. New generations were born who had not witnessed the fire. The harbour grew busier. Industry expanded. The Enlightenment reached Scotland, bringing with it scientific thought, philosophical doubt, and a slow dismantling of superstition disguised as certainty. And yet the witch trials were not erased. And so Grissel Jaffray's story lingered in a strange space, not openly celebrated, not officially condemned, just remembered. It is often in folklore, rather than formal history, that guilt finds its expression. Grissel's continued presence in Dundee's collective imagination suggests that her execution was never fully reconciled. The town had punished her, but had it resolved what led to her punishment? Historians in later centuries examined Scottish witch trials. They found patterns, not of isolated madness, but of systemic belief reinforced by authority. They found records of coercion, of flawed evidence, of communities driven by fear rather than proof. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Scotland began to revisit this history more openly. Scholars documented the scale of the persecution. Campaigners called for posthumous pardons. Discussions emerged about memorials to the accused and executed. The narrative shifted. Where once the accused were labelled witches, they are now most often described as victims of injustice. The shift does not change the past, but it changes how it is held. In Dundee, the house remains. Its stones have weathered centuries of rain. Names carved deep in granite have softened to near invisibility. Visitors walk through the gates daily. Some tourists, some locals, some unaware of the layers beneath their feet. Few think immediately of Grissel Jaffray, yet the atmosphere described by those who linger there suggests something unresolved, as though the ground itself remembers an imbalance. Because in places where the dead are denied rest, stories begin. And Dundee began to tell one. At first gently, then with increasing consistency. They said she was seen. Not immediately, not in the days after her death, but years later. A figure in grey walking slowly through the old streets. A woman moving with quiet purpose near kirkyard walls. Never threatening, never speaking, simply present. The fire that was meant to erase her had not accomplished its task. It had done something else instead. It had fixed her into the town's consciousness, not as a witch, but as memory. And memory, once ignited, does not extinguish easily. The fires ended. The records closed. The officials moved on. But Dundee did not entirely forget. In the decades after the execution of Grissel Jaffray, the town changed in small ways. Buildings were repaired. Generations shifted. Those who had stood in the crowd grew older and then were buried themselves. Yet something remained unsettled. It began as stories often do, not in proclamation, but in quiet suggestion. Someone glimpsed a woman walking near the burial ground after dusk. Someone heard footsteps on gravel when no one else was present. Someone felt an unexpected cold in a place that had been warm moments before. The location most often named was the Howth. The Howth sits at the centre of Old Dundee, enclosed by weathered stone walls. By day it is unassuming, rows of gravestones, inscriptions softened by time, a place of reflection rather than fear. By night it becomes different. Sound does not travel as it does in open streets. Light from surrounding buildings rarely penetrates deeply between the stones. Shadows gather more densely than expected. It was here that the figure came to be known as the Grey Lady. Witnesses described her similarly across generations. A middle-aged woman, clothed plainly, head covered, walking slowly, never running, never turning abruptly, simply moving. Those who saw her did not describe violence. They described sadness, an impression of weight carried quietly. Some accounts tell of her pausing beside certain stones, though none bore her name. Others say she traced the perimeter walls as if following a path invisible to modern eyes. There were also reports beyond the cemetery. In older streets near the kirk, in narrow closes that once existed in Grissel's time, a figure glimpsed briefly at a doorway, dissolving when approached. What makes these stories endure is not drama, but restraint. The Grey Lady does not scream. She does not threaten. She does not pursue. She exists. Over time, local folklore began to link her unmistakably with Grissel Jaffray. Though no official record declared it so, the association grew stronger. A woman executed unjustly, denied burial among her neighbours, denied voice, yet seen. It is telling that her apparition, as described, is not grotesque, not distorted, not monstrous. She appears as she would have in life. Plain dress, grey tones with quiet movement. If Grissel's spirit walks, whether literally or symbolically, perhaps it walks differently now, not as accusation, not as warning, but as reminder that certainty can be dangerous, that fear, when legitimised, burns indiscriminately, and that communities, no matter how devout or convinced, are capable of grave error. Grissel Jaffray does not haunt Dundee in anger. She walks it in witness. And perhaps that is her final act. Not vengeance, not fear, but endurance. A woman once burned into silence, now carried quietly through time.